production in aquatic systems, and not the classical one, which would be fully under anaerobic conditions, so oxygen-free conditions. But I will talk about methane production in oxic waters. But first of all, I want to thank many people who helped doing all this type of research and all the measurements in the field and also in the lab. And of course, my funding agencies, which are the European Science Foundation and also several German organizations. So as you probably all know, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, and it has been increasing during the industrial age quite substantially. Whereas carbon dioxide has increased by 40% during the industrialization, methane has increased by more than 200%. So it's of a major concern in terms of environmental issues. And what you also see is that in particular in the last years, the concentration of methane has increased again in the atmosphere after reaching a kind of a plateau phase in the early 2000s. And this increase is mainly related to the behavior of the oxygen, which are now releasing substantial amount of methane. And why is it so important? It is important because it has a much higher global warming potential than in comparison to CO2. It is 84 times more active on a 20-year time range. So if you add methane into the atmosphere, you get a 84 times higher warming potential. And if you look at the global methane budget, you can see there are two major approaches. There is a bottom-up approach and a top-down approach. They lead to very different numbers. So if you look at the dimension, it is a difference by more than 20%. And you also see that there is quite a variability in the different measurements. And that is basically related to the effect that we hardly know all the mechanisms and sources of methane. We are mainly concentrating on natural sources and in particular to aquatic sources, which roughly account to 320 teragram methane per year, which is in total 44% of the total methane emission. But there are definitely very high uncertainties, in particular in the fresh and in the brackish waters. And you can also see, if you look over time, there have been very different calculations which resulted in very different numbers, to be honest. And over the time, the percentage, in particular of aquatic sources to global carbon methane emission has increased quite a bit. But all these studies show, even a study here from 2007 from Rieberg et al., they show that wetlands and also boreal bogs and swamp areas are substantial contributors to the production of methane, but also to the emission. And the same is also true to ocean and freshwaters. And in particular there is a very high uncertainty. However, you can say that the aquatic systems globally contribute to a substantial amount of methane emission. And the latest report by Sornois et al. Shows that freshwaters alone can contribute up to 30% of the total methane emission. And why is it interesting? In earlier times, methane production was just believed to occur in anoxic environments. So you have different mechanisms, mainly three mechanisms in aquatic systems. You have diffusion, which releases methane from the water column into the atmosphere. You have ebullition. This is basically formation of gas bubbles, which will reach the surface and reach the atmosphere. And then you have an efflux. It's basically a chimney effect by macrophytes and also some plants. However, we have done several measurements, and already early measurements in the 1970s and then also in the 90s show that there is also methane present in the oxic water column. And Rieberg, in his review, showed, and he called it oxic methane paradox, that this methane peak in oxic waters is quite common and can be measured in almost all water bodies. And later on, especially in the past decade, there have been a lot of studies showing that there is quite a substantial amount of methane in the upper oxic water column. And why is it important? You can see here, you have this methane peak. It's mainly related to the temperature stratification of your water column. And it's quite close to the surface where basically the emission is taking place. So much of this methane will be directly released into the atmosphere. And there are several organisms involved, which we know are producing methane. However, most of the processes are not well characterized yet. And you can see there have been some studies, in particular in the past years, which show that methane can be indeed produced by various mechanisms in the oxic water column. One of the first studies showing a precise mechanism is the oxic methane formation from methylphosphonates, whereby phosphonates are cleaved by bacteria and demethylated, and the methane is released into the water. And later studies also of our group show that methane can be also produced during photosynthesis of different aquatic organisms, mainly prokaryotic cyanobacteria and also eukaryotic phytoplankton. I just mentioned this. This is a very well characterized process. These are the methylphosphonates. It's mainly the demethylation of a methyl group, which is then reduced to methane. However, there are different other mechanisms known, in particular the demethylation of certain other amines, which are basically degradation products of organic matter, but also methanol can be transformed to methane, and that is mainly related to the methyl coenzyme M, and this enzyme is usually very oxygen sensitive. That was also the reason why people believed that methane formation is only occurring in anoxic waters. However, there could be also a hypothetical methanogenesis pathway, because this methyl coenzyme M, we could have an equivalent which is less oxygen sensitive and thereby can also produce methane in oxic waters. This still has to be proven, but there are indications from genome studies that this can be the case. So what we did is we performed a lot of different methods to measure in situ in the system the methane concentration and also to figure out what processes are involved in the methane production. In our lake, Lake Stechlin, which is in the northeastern part of Germany, we often find this typical methane peak, which is related to the lake stratification, and it is also related to the oxygen peak, which is a kind of contradictory to the previous methane formation in anoxic waters, and it's also related to the peak in phytoplankton. So there is a linkage between phytoplankton production and methane production. And to test for it, we did several incubations at different depths, which follow basically this methane profile. And by doing so, we could actually see that the highest methane production is actually taking place at the peak location, which indicates that where the methane accumulates, there's also the highest production taking place. And then we looked over the season, and here you see the methane concentration in the water column. At the x-axis, you have the depths from 0 to 50 meters, and then you have the time on the x-axis. And what you can see is that you have certain areas or depth horizons where the methane production takes place, and it's also very depending on the season when you are looking at, and you can see it's correlating well with the oxygen concentration, which is an indication of photosynthesis again. And you see it's basically along the thermocline, which is around 6 to 7 meters. And it is inversely correlated to the phosphorus concentration. So this indicates that phosphorus P-limited photosynthesis could be related in methane production. The relationship between phytoplankton biomass and methane has been also shown by our Canadian colleagues from Montreal. And what they did is they looked into mesocosms, which are experimental facilities, but they also looked globally in different lakes where methane has been measured. And you can nicely see here, you have the chlorophyll concentration, which is an indicator for phytoplankton biomass. And on the x-axis, you have the methane concentration, and you can see a nice relationship. So if you have higher phytoplankton biomass, you also get a higher methane production. And this is also what we see in our lake. Here we looked over 3 years from 2014, 15, and 16. And you can see that you have higher methane concentrations, again, closer to the thermocline. And you also see this temporal dynamics. And this temporal dynamics is nicely related to the occurrence of cyanobacteria, which are blue-green algae. They are prokaryotic, so therefore they are bacteria and not eukaryotic algae. And what we could show by using a membrane inlet mass spectrometry, which has a shortcut MIMS, these measurements nicely show that in several phytoplankton cultures, these are cyanobacteria, Microcystis aeruginosa, different strains, and you can see that we get a nice signal indicating that these cyanobacteria can actively produce methane. And the interesting part is it's not only restricted to aquatic cyanobacteria, but it also occurs in desert soil and also other terrestrial cyanobacteria. And by looking in a more day-night cycle, we can also indicate that the methane production, which is here this brown reddish line, has peaks in relation to the the day-night cycle. And if you calculate the net methane production, you can see that usually the peak is occurring during the transition from light to dark. However, if you compare different strains and cyanobacterial species, you can also see a slight difference when exactly the peak in methane production occurs, indicating that there might be slightly differences involved. And the nice thing is that you have species dependent differences. So Synechococcus, which is a very common cyanobacterium in the ocean, usually doesn't produce as much per cell. So we have here the methane production in picomole per 1 million cell per hour. And if you compare it to another very common and abundant cyanobacterium in the ocean, you can see that these strains usually produce much higher amounts of methane. And if we compare different habitats, marine, freshwater, and terrestrial habitats, you can also see that there is quite some variability in the rate of methane production, and you also have differences between different strains. However, there is not a real substantial difference between the different habitats, just because you also have a very high variability between the different strains. So what did we learn so far from these measurements? We see that methane occurs in the aerobic water column. We can state that this is a fact now. We also see that almost no archaea which have been related to anoxic methane formation, they are not abundant in the oxic waters just because they cannot resist high oxygen concentrations. However, we have high rates of phytoplankton production, and quite often cyanobacteria are the dominant species. And therefore, we can say there is a high importance for aquatic methane production in oxic environments. So we were questioning, are there possible other mechanisms? And the most important question is, are these mechanisms actually important or relevant for the global greenhouse gas fluxes? And if we, for example, do a rough calculation of the possible methane production by cyanobacteria, we come to the conclusion that in minimum 8% of the total naturally produced methane is produced by cyanobacteria. However, you can already see that the calculation has a high uncertainty, and this uncertainty is mainly related to environmental factors, which we cannot always measure and define well. So there is still a lot of place that this number, this 8%, could be substantially higher. And why is it important to look at phytoplankton-related methane production? The production, as I mentioned before, is taking place close to the surface. So you have different mechanisms, in particular wind-induced turbulence, which increases the methane release to the atmosphere. And the important point is that the methane doesn't stay very long in the water column and therefore escapes methane oxidation, which it would be related to the concentration, to the oxygen concentration. However, since the methane can be directly released into the atmosphere quite rapidly, only a small percentage will be oxidized. And we did a calculation for our lake, and taking into account the different possible mechanisms which define your mass balance. And by doing so, you can see that we end up between 50% in one of the basins and 64% in another basin. So more than 50% of the total methane flux from this lake is dependent on oxic methane production. And the open question is still, how important is it on a global scale? And there are just 5 studies out right now which have addressed this issue. It's mainly addressing the ecosystem scale. However, we need to scale up onto the global scale to fully understand the importance of this process. And there have been a study who tried to compare different lake ecosystem and relates it to basically the size of the lake ecosystems, or it's basically the ratio of the littoral sediment, which is a coastal sediment area, to the total surface mixed layer volume, which is the upper water layer, and to the percentage of the oxic methane production contributing to the overall methane flux. And you can see that there is a nice correlation between basically the lake size and the contribution to overall methane flux from these systems. So the larger the lakes, the higher the percentage of this oxic methane production was. And our goal is now to include these mechanisms, the oxic methane production, into global models to see the importance of these of the oxic methane production in aquatic systems. So I think oxic methane production is quite important, and it has been an overlooked process, although people have realized already in the early days of methane measurement that methane can accumulate in the upper water columns. And now it's time to define how much does it contribute to the total global methane flux to the atmosphere, and how much it will impact the global warming potential. And as you know, we have the strong increase in both greenhouse gases, CO2 and methane. And right now, methane is of a quite important topic, because if this methane production is related to the phytoplankton production, what we see on a global scale is that eutrophication, which is the input of nutrients, increases overall primary production and leads to increasing methane production and therefore also fluxes to the atmosphere. So we have basically a positive feedback loop created by us humans. So anthropogenic impacts have direct consequences, not only for the direct release by burning fossil fuels, but also by stimulating natural processes leading to an increased flux of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And with that, I will end. Many thanks for listening.